Welcome back to another episode of TimeOut with the Sports Doctor podcast, where life, sports, and medicine intersects. We are glad that you are part of this growing community where we strive to help you strengthen your mindset, help you grow your assets, and help you achieve whatever level of success that you want for your life. Go to our website at Dr.Derrick, thesportsdoctor.com, where you can find all the latest content, and you can also follow us on our social media channels. Now, let's get into this episode. All right, so welcome back to another episode of Time Out with the Sports Doctor, and we have a very special guest for you, Dr. Frances Mei Hardin, who is a ENT doctor or otolaryngologist. She is the first ENT doctor to be on Time Out with the Sports Doctor, so welcome. And she's also a brand new podcaster, so I'm very excited to connect with her and to learn more about her brand, Rethinking Residency. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. Really, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk about these upcoming projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So just probably a week or two ago, I'm going through Instagram, looking at different posts like I typically do, and I come across a new surgeon with a new podcast, Promising Young Surgeon, with very dope artwork. So it jumped out to me. And, I remember I've been in the podcast space now for almost 3 years. So I remember those times leading up to the launch of the podcast and sometimes how the different things are going through your mind, different emotions. So, I just reached out to give some encouraging words. And basically, this is how we're here now.
Yeah, I really appreciated that. Like every, stray Instagram comment, it's very appreciated. I thought your short, message was so kind, and it's great to learn from people who have already kind of paved the way and had great success in the physician podcaster space.
Yeah, so I think physician podcasters is definitely a growing space, but there's still not many people. What you will find, what I've found in the past is that you have people who are kind of part-time workers, so to speak, or shift workers, ER doctors, or people who do part-time medicine and part-time entrepreneurship, but very few times will you find a full-time surgeon who's doing podcasting or doing other things. So it's always very interesting when I find someone else like that I can connect with.
Yeah, some days are busier than others, but
Yeah,
it feels like full speed ahead at
yeah,
this season of life for sure.
right. And just an example of the podcast community and how small the medical community is. Before we started recording, you mentioned that you saw some of my sponsors, Dr. Stephanie Pearson and Pearson Ravitz, who has been a great supporter of this podcast. And tell us your connection with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just congratulating him. I was like, man, I was going through your sponsors page and it's pretty epic. And I use Pearson Ravitz for my disability insurance, and I have for several years. They were the group that was recommended to me by a young female co-resident when I was in residency. And I really loved the company, loved their story, and I've been with them ever since. So what a cool sponsor.
Yeah, no, that is too awesome. I mean, that's something that you can't plan, right? That was completely unscripted. All right, so let's talk first about kind of your backstory. What led you to want to pursue a career in ENT medicine or ENT, and how you are, now starting as a attending surgeon, as a physician in this space.
So, without going too much into the early years, I did leave home at 13 to go to a boarding high school, the Illinois Math and Science Academy, where I was for 3 years. And then I went to Notre Dame at 16 and graduated from there at 20 with a degree in biochemistry. And what I joke about at the time is that, I am first generation half Asian American, and I joke that my parents really wanted me to be a doctor and I wanted to be a graphic designer. So we compromised and I became a surgeon.
There you
But
go.
in all seriousness, I did take a gap year just because coming out of college, I had looked at PhD versus MD options. During that gap year, I really did love my experience in outcomes research and ENT specifically. So I went on to medical school at Case Western in Cleveland, and I had really decided before even entering medical school, just based on my year of ENT outcomes research, that was what I wanted to do. What I loved about ENT surgeons was that their reputation in the hospital at the time, I mean, this is 2012, was that they were the quote unquote nice but weird surgeons. And then I was like, oh, okay, I can do that. Like, I've
Yeah.
heard some bad rumors about like other types of surgery and things like that. And I knew I didn't want to be, like in a malignant work environment or anything. But I was like, honestly, the nerds, I can mess with the nerds. So ENT seemed like a natural fit. The other piece of advice that I give often, like if younger people ask me, is that, you pick the bodily fluids that you can tolerate. So, I mean, for instance, some of us are afraid of bone saws. Like I would put myself in that group,
Yeah.
but obviously I also didn't like, gangrenous toes and, some really anything in the abdomen. And what is nice about my current job, yes, I'm a full-time practicing ENT, but when a patient comes in and they start trying to take off their shirt and they're like, you got to look at this strange mole on my lower back, I just say, respectfully, I only do clavicles up. So no need to take your shirt off. And
Sure.
that's kind of how I got to ENT. I completed my 5-year ENT residency at a program in the Midwest, and I'm now in my second year of practice as an attending, and I work alone in solo practice at a rural community hospital in Middle Tennessee. So
Got it.
that's where I'm at now.
Very nice. So 13 years old, leaving home. My daughter is 13 now, and there is no way at all that we will allow her to leave today to go to boarding school. So what was that experience like?
Well, I was an only child. My parents were super attentive. What was nice is that I was born and raised in Chicago, and this boarding school was a little under an hour away. So they were at every volleyball game. My first year there as a 13-year-old, I would go home on weekends, and my parents were still definitely very present in a good way, even
Yeah,
though I was, living on campus with a roommate.
got it. Got it. But how did that shape you as far as your career and going to college later, med school? What experience did you take from being a boarding student?
Honestly, the best thing that I got from that experience was a sense of community and the ability to really learn the social skills that I would take on for the rest of my career. And what I mean by that is that I was born and raised in, a town in Chicago. It's at the end of the Green Line. So I think I am legally allowed to say, it's kind of at the edge of Chicago, one of the first tier suburbs. But it was a very non diverse town. And I don't know how to say this nicely, but I was extraordinarily unpopular. I
Sure.
mean, I was just, I was taking classes at the community college in 7th grade so that I could apply to the Illinois Math and Science Academy. I was in Chinese school. I was playing piano competitively. I was in bell choir at church. I was lecturing at church. I altar served for a few years, so like spending a ton of time at the Catholic Mass. But yeah, just again, I had a hard time kind of finding any group to fit in with. Whereas when I went to boarding school, what's so funny is that I actually became more of like the popular dumb jock. I was still to this day. I mean, I've got to be one of the dumber kids that they accepted into that school. I broke every volleyball record, and people were like, "Oh my gosh, like, this girl's got it." And it was so funny, and that opportunity to be in that position for a couple years, I really do think that it transformed my ability to like connect with other people, hone some social skills, and like really change the trajectory for my life.
So I like the fact that you shared that you were the dumb jock, right? Who's now the ENT surgeon who graduated medical school in what early 20s, but you found your community. You found the people who you could identify with. You're in a large city, Chicago, and you can't find your group or your tribe, but you were able to get into a small network. And as you were saying that you were the minority, as far as diversity, now look at you as an ENT surgeon, right? So I'm sure that skill set, because ENT I don't know the diversity. I know orthopedics, less than 2% African American, still, I believe, less than 6% female. So I can imagine that the numbers are not vastly different in ENT. So, what are the numbers as far as minorities in ENT?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the last statistic that I heard was actually several years ago. One of my chief residents and now my friends, Dr. Ukatu, she did her final chief year grand rounds. The last slide had a unicorn on it. And she was just like, I want to thank you guys for these 5 years and for this ride. And the statistics for African American female otolaryngologists was less than 1%. And so
Wow.
truly a unicorn. And, I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about it, but she was just a phenomenal chief resident and surgeon. And I definitely, made a note of that when she presented it to us.
Sure, sure. So, talk to us about now that you're on the other side of training and in practice yourself. Why did you come up with the Rethinking Residency brand?
Yeah. So Rethinking Residency is a brand and a platform that I created in order to publish materials that would support physician well-being and mental health with a specific focus on the resident physician. Sure, absolutely, fellows included, medical students who are trying to best prepare themselves for residency. But the reason is because when I went through my residency training, which was at a malignant program, those 5 years, these resources really didn't exist. And so there were many nights where late in the evening, 9, 10 p.m., I'd be laying on the floor of the bathroom in the basement of the hospital, crying, reading on my phone, just Googling things like resident physician suicide, resident physician depression, and leaving residency. And there were just almost no resources that came up. It was shocking at the time because there was such a huge void. Like these days, you can't Google much and get almost nothing. There were a little bit of like
Right.
AMA and ACGME one-page PDF materials and things like that. And so what I've done with this brand is really create a community of people who do want to connect regarding these types of residency experiences. Like it is awesome when aspects of our medical training or the journey to becoming a surgeon go well. And fortunately in my life, like I really was very lucky and I had the benefit of such a strong early education, undergraduate experience, medical school experience, a year of outcomes research. But yeah, unfortunately, luck had kind of run out by residency. And so this really is born out of a passion to help other resident physicians who could be in situations similar to mine because there really was overt, verbal abuse. There were instances of physical abuse. It was just a very difficult environment to navigate. And I would argue that, that's going to be harmful to our young surgeons. It's certainly harmful to me.
Sure, sure. Well, first, thank you for being so vulnerable to speak about your experiences and to speak about the reality of what residency was for you, because it's different for everybody. And when I can only imagine how lonely you felt during those times when, like you said, you couldn't even find something on the telephone to help with what you're going through, let alone find somebody in the hospital to identify with or feel comfortable enough to talk to. So the pain that you endured then is going to make, number one, your podcast very popular, and also going to allow other people to be able to identify with you. One thing I will always talk about here is it's one thing for you to come on and say, look, I'm an ENT doctor. I went to boarding school. I graduated at 20. I graduated at 24, whatever. And people like, well, all right, I can't identify with her because she's super smart and, she's an ENT doctor. I want to be a doctor, but I failed at this and I failed at that. But when you open up and say, look, I struggled here, and look, I'm still here now, despite everything I've been through, I feel that that makes you more human and allows other people to identify with you and makes you more approachable so that other people will actually reach out. So not only are you starting a podcast, you're starting a platform, as you mentioned earlier, where other people will be able to connect with you and you'll probably save some lives as you go through what you're doing.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's certainly the hope. And in the past year, because we just passed the 1 year mark on rethinkingresidency.com, and that resource, we went into it with the thought that if this does save one life, then it would be worth it, because it has been like hundreds of hours of just effort in free time over this time period.
Sure, sure. So Rethinking Residency and your podcast are two separate entities, correct?
Yes, correct. So rethinkingresidency.com, that's an LLC that I created and own. And just a quick plug for some like different examples of resources on there. Like, okay, so really helpful distress tolerance skills. So any young surgeon in training can go and look at the website and look for distress tolerance skills that will help them when they're scrubbed into the OR. That is, of course, such a unique, very singular type of experience that there aren't adaptations of different, behavioral therapies or dialectic skills for the person in that situation. And so I just basically hit a point where I was kind of growing weary of hearing the same thing over again, which would be like, okay, are you kind of reaching your threshold? Like, take a walk around the block, look at something green, listen to your favorite song. It's like those people have never been scrubbed into the operating room with an attending or a senior resident screaming in their face. They just obviously haven't, because then they wouldn't be on this trees and music stuff. It's like,
Right.
be real.
What do I do right now? Like,
Yeah,
right.
grow up. Like, just what can a
Yeah.
person do? And not only that, but then you get into really practical, like I've practiced yoga for several years, and scrubbed in, you still don't have access to so many different like soothing or vagal reset type of maneuvers. And so, anyway, we have distress tolerance skills. We have an interview that I conducted with a phenomenal general surgeon. It's on overcoming substance use in residency and fellowship. And their experience in a PHP. So that's a great resource. There are other similarly intimate but helpful roadmaps. One example being a resident who took a mental health sabbatical during residency training. What did that look like practically? What were the conversations with the program director? And how could you take that as a roadmap to your own program director if they have no clue how to like make that work for you?
Yeah, no, those are all very, very specific occurrences that will come up, but you probably won't be able to find a resource. But it's great that you're building that. As healthcare providers, we spend a large portion of our lives focused on our training as well as taking care of other individuals. But I'm calling a timeout because life can change in an instant. We know it's difficult to fathom that a sudden illness, injury, or death could put you and your family in a devastating financial situation. But that's where Dr. Stephanie Pearson and her unique team of advisors at Pearson Ravitz come into play. They focus on empowering physicians like yourself to protect your most valuable asset, your income, and life's most important people, your family. So go to pearsonravitz.com to make sure that you are protected today.
Yep. And then Promising Young Surgeon, like you mentioned, it is a distinct entity. I signed with a network in January 2024 to bring seasons of this brand new show to life. And what I'm so passionate about is that Rethinking Residency is meant to just be an effective and neutral resource. And that's what it is. Like, I put a lot of effort into making it that type of a safe place, because of course that means that we've got to be like just very fair. It's just very open and neutral. That being said, Promising Young Surgeon is such a fun opportunity for me to be myself. So getting really into the nitty gritty of my own story, the healing process, the damage process in training, and everything in between. But those views will truly be my own. And I am looking forward to getting more personal in a way where hopefully listeners can say, okay, yes, this person gets it. It's so hard to describe to people who don't know residency what it's like, or who don't get it. Maybe their experience was so wonderful that they cannot conceive of what some other people's are going through.
Sure,
Okay,
sure.
well, I want to be that type of a person.
Yeah, no, there's different experiences. Some people struggle, some people excel, some people are loved, some people are hated. But to make it through, you have to really be able to be, I always say that you have to be callous, but you can't be bitter, right? Because when you're in the operating room and you have a patient on the table and things are going wrong, or you have somebody who's yelling at you, screaming at you, you still have to be able to perform under that duress, right? You have to be able to stay focused. You have to be able to think through logically, systematically, and not be able to just lose it. So it's a skill set. One thing I saw on your website, there's the curriculum and then there's the informal curriculum, right? So many things are not taught during our formal training because there has to be so much time spent on the skill set and the patient care and the history taken and the learning how to read a CT scan and MRI, that the business of medicine, or even kind of the patient care in general, the actual taking care of a patient, can be missed at many times or just kind of overlooked because there's not enough time in a day to really address everything.
Totally. And I agree with that. And, obviously I can relate because fundamentally, as an otolaryngologist, I'm also an airway surgeon. I've done countless, several dozen airway emergencies. And that is such a specific skill set. And you have to be so cool. And
Yeah,
I guess that in my experience, though, I know what kind of learner I am. And I do prefer to be taught things in a way that doesn't involve fear, intimidation, bullying. Like
right.
that just straight up is kind of my own preference. And I do think that, especially with this next generation, the younger generation of doctors and surgeons, they also can kind of know their own learning style. Many of them may agree with me, like, hey, I don't really think bullying is super professional or the optimal way for me to learn. And so all I'm saying is that I use my background, my educational background, things like that. The fact that my first academic publication was at age 16 in an astrophysics journal to just argue. Well, here's my argument summed up. I don't have any issues with mentation. And certainly, if it could be explained to me like calmly one time, I really have like excellent memory and understanding, and I learn quickly. But when you're at a teaching hospital that doesn't share any of those values, then it can be really difficult. And a person who's working in a traumatic work environment over several years, they're going to really arguably not learn as well as they would have if the environment was slightly less malignant.
Yeah, it definitely takes a toll on you. And I think for my teaching style, when I work with residents, is I want to treat them how I want to be treated, number one. But definitely the old school way, especially in surgery, it was completely polar opposite. It was more of a, you have to learn the hard way and you have to push through this because you have to be ready for life. That works for some people, especially in the current environment with how children are being raised. That just doesn't work for people. And we have to come up with different ways of how to train upcoming doctors or surgeons so they can still effectively be able to treat patients without being intimidated.
And not only that, but there's a very well known now publicized physician shortage, the surgeon shortage. I think that the next generation hears these horror stories and it's like it's going to be harder to convince a really
Right.
brilliant young person why they should sign up to be treated this way
Yeah.
to get to
No, I
whatever
agree.
end goal when tech exists and business consulting exists. I mean, it's a
And
hard
TikTok.
sell. Yes, and TikTok, like that would be better. Maybe the same amount of bullying,
Right, right.
but less in your face.
So tell us about, in addition to all this, you are a college athlete. So talk to us about your rowing career.
Yeah, so I actually walked on to the team at Notre Dame. My roommate and I were both like 6 feet and over. And so the coach had kind of been like scoping out people in the dorms and things like that and kind of encouraged us to come try out and then walk on. And so even though I was a lifelong volleyball player, like had been looking at D3 schools to play volleyball in college, I ended up at Notre Dame where I would eventually just play club volleyball while I was there. But I basically picked up this totally new sport for rowing. And I guess what's fun to think about at that time is that for people who aren't familiar with rowing, I was in an 8-man boat. And the middle four girls on that boat, they're called the meat packers. And that was my position. So I was a meat packer. I'm 6 feet tall and
Right.
I have like swimmer's shoulders. So yes, I sat in a meat packer's position, and it was a really fun experience. It involved a lot of two-a-day practices, erging until you throw up or roll off of the machine and things like that. And again, I guess I would point to things like that, like competing at that high of a level athletically, to things like resilience. And so again, when we start to tell residents, hey, you just need to be more resilient, when they typically are like the most resilient people from their little
Right.
microcosm,
Yeah.
it so misses the point. And there's an element of fairness in sports, like having competed in sports all this time. There's an element of fairness there that was just totally absent in my experience in the hospital. And I think that that's part of, why it's difficult to learn in that setting.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Number one, I never would have guessed that you were 6 feet tall. But it is amazing. Like you said, you just push yourself until you can't go any farther. But that resilience that you learn as an athlete definitely plays off through it's 5 year residency program, right?
Mhm.
Because at points, I'm sure during the residency, every resident at some point is like, okay, I can tap out of this now and just go about my life, or I can push through. It's very few people, I think, that make it through a program without actually thinking about that thought at one point. My why was that I did not, number one, I'm a first generation physician. I knew that a lot of people were looking at me to succeed. And if I didn't do it, then they wouldn't believe that they could do it either. So, and I didn't want the alternative of having to go back home and just find a job with all this debt. So I pushed through, number one, not getting accepted into orthopedics, struggling some as a resident, and it's worth it now. But when you look back over all the things that you had to overcome as a resident, it's almost like, how did I make it through? And I know in my instance, it's by the grace of God that I made it through, that I even got into residency, number one. But I feel that people need to know that it's not easy. Number one, it's not easy at all, but it's doable. And you just have to really, it helps when you're in a supportive program, but if you're not, you have to be able to connect with other people, like-minded people, like the program that you're building.
Totally. And, I do give like medical student lectures, even just recently 2 months ago, and they're so well received because what I do for medical students is that I just want to go to medical schools, give an hour or 2-hour lecture or a boot camp, and it will be titled something like Optimizing Your Interpersonal Effectiveness. And it's just a very deep dive on interpersonal effectiveness skills. Again, those are based in dialectic behavioral therapy, but it's so helpful to hear and strategize with somebody, hear from and strategize with somebody who gets it, who's been in those awkward, ranging from awkward to terrifying situations in the hospital, clinically, surgically, any of it. And so we just kind of go through the skills and we say, okay, you're the senior resident and your junior resident is not updating the list every day like they are
Yeah.
supposed to. They know that that's part of their task. Like probably every resident on earth is like, yeah, that's happened to me.
Right.
We've all been the junior resident who forgot to update the list. And
Right.
then we've all been the senior resident who's like, man, I keep asking this guy to update the list. But there are these skills. There are like really sophisticated frameworks for how to approach this. And the whole point of interpersonal effectiveness skills is that you can get what you want while maintaining a positive relationship with the person. Like those are kind of the crux of those skills. And so what I tell medical students is, it would be awesome if you never need any of these skills a day in your life, any of the distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, arguably they will benefit you in your work life, your social life, your home life. So it's worth listening to this. But here's the other thing is that you may need them during your training at some point, during residency, fellowship, early career, anything as an attending. And I would just rather that you hear them from me. And the medical students respond
Yeah.
really well to that because, why not? And I think that they really do respect that as a subspecialty surgeon, I take time away from the operating room to be like, I have to tell you guys this. Someone's got to tell you because otherwise, you read a book like The House of God, which I did as a fourth year medical student. And I thought, wow, that was a really well-written book. I loved the fiction. I can see that it was published in 1978. And so the old days of surgery looked totally berserk. I was like, wow, what a crazy book. And I literally entered residency not having heard anyone speak honestly about like the possibilities that one would encounter the environment that I did. Because, my experience was definitely similar to or much scarier than House of God.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's amazing. So on Timeout with the Sports Doctor, this is your final timeout. So first of all, kudos to you as a budding young surgeon, a person who is going to be able to impact many people through your platform. But I just want to speak to your why, right? Because you have a lot going on and you have a career that you have to focus on, but you're able to multitask and seemingly get all these things done together. But why is it important for you to be more than a ENT surgeon? Why is it important for you to be a podcaster, to be a motivational speaker, to be a mentor for other people in the space?
Yeah, it's really important to me because I am trying to be the person that I needed when I was a resident. And so, I do think that this even plays into my full-time ENT practice because I care a lot about like walking the walk as well. And the 7 women who work in clinic with me, they've all worked in other surgeons' offices before. We all know what it's like when someone's like slamming doors, screaming at people, making people cry in the office. And so I really care about being like a different kind of surgeon, and I care about making it kind of a softer world for the next generation.
Oh, that's great. And that's what it's truly about, impacting lives and being able to share your pain points with others so that hopefully they don't have to go through the same struggles that you might have had to endure. So tell everyone how they can follow, number one, your platform and when they can find the information about this new podcast of Promising Young Surgeon.
Awesome. Thanks. So, Rethinking Residency can be found at rethinkingresidency.com. All of the resources are on there. There is an Instagram at Rethinking Residency. And then my Instagram is at francismay.md. And then Promising Young Surgeon will be coming out on March 12th. And definitely please follow along with us every week as we drop new episodes.
Perfect. Well, we'll get all that information in the show notes, and we will definitely try to use everyone that we know in this community to support what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for continuing to support this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then please leave a 5-star review. And if you haven't done so, subscribe so you continue to get the updated episodes. Until later, peace. Time out with the sports doctor. Keep our head right in the game. We ain't never stopping. You are now tuned in. Trust you don't want to miss. This is where life, sports, and medicine.